Hello and welcome back to the front page with me, your host, Racing Post editor Tom Kerr. Regular viewers of the show will note that we're not in the studio as usual and that we were unfortunately conspicuous by our absence last week. Sadly, as viewers of some other Racing Post shows may know, we've experienced some moderately catastrophic technical issues in our London studios, all of which we're now steadily are being worked through. But that does mean that we are coming to you remotely rather than from our London studio for this week only. But all of that means we've got plenty to get through today, not least because we are coming out of the back of the Dublin Racing Festival and into the crunch period of the racing calendar. So to cover this all, we have assembled a crack panel of racing experts. They are Chris Cook, our senior writer and the reigning racing writer of the year. Bill Barber, our industry editor, who understands the politics and business of racing like no one else. And our scoop hunter-in-chief, West Country correspondent, James Stevens. Hello, gents. Welcome all. Let's get cracking. Where else could we begin this week's show but the Dublin Racing Festival, or as Nicky Henderson presciently dubbed it, the Willie Mullins Racing Festival? The Irish champion trainer recorded a staggering clean sweep of Grade 1s, 8 from 8 at Leopardstown, in a show that wasn't just dominance, it was a tidal wave crashing over a sandcastle. So, gentlemen, first of all, we have to pay tribute to what a stunning training performance it was. This is a maestro about whom it is almost impossible to find something new to say, so who better to try to do that than the racing writer of the year, Chris Cook. What do we think about Willie Mullins, Chris?
Well, thinking about this stable just requires you to think about racing differently. You know, if you sort of got into the sport about 40 years ago, as I did, there was a very common expression. Do you remember? If you think you got more than one Derby horse, you don't have any, because the idea was that the talent would generally be so spread around. You know, you would have to have an outstanding horse to compete in the best races. And you know, that kind of saying used to be true, but I mean, it seems like Willie has a very high percentage of all the best jump racing talent these days. And over the weekend, you know, we saw that in full effect. He wasn't just, you know, winning those top class races. He was having placed horses as well. If he happened to have a favourite that disappointed, then one of his others would step up. I think there was just in all the Grade 1s, there was only one favourite that was trained by somebody else. And he got that one beat. So it's just extraordinary stuff. I tried to toss up where all the prize money went on the Saturday of the Dublin Racing Festival. I think 61% of it went to Willie's yard. And you know, that is going to have the sort of long-term consequence of tilting the table even more in his favour, isn't it? Because he's got so much more money to invest. It's 39% of that prize money from Saturday spread around all other stables in Ireland, and actually some of it was carried off to Britain, wasn't it, in the very last race? So funding for future talent is all going towards his owners, and I'm sure they're delighted with what happened, and of course they'll all be looking to reinvest, and the future looks very rosy for Closutton. I think it's only going to go more and more in this direction.
It's an ominous prospect, that. But before we come on to the perhaps slightly more worrying aspects of Mullins' domination, let's start with some of his superstars who we are justifiably excited about seeing strutting their stuff at Cheltenham in March. First of all, Gold Cup favourite Galopin Des Champs, who wasn't quite as exuberant as he was at Christmas, but he's put old foe fast or slow to the sword in pretty good style. James, do we think he is a shoo-in for his Gold Cup defence, or is there anything out there to worry the Mullins camp?
I think on the basis of what he's achieved in the latter parts of this season, there definitely looks that way. We saw what he did over Christmas. I felt that was very much a sort of explosion back to Galopin Des Champs, back to his best. Whereas I thought this weekend, I thought he was very good. I thought it was straightforward. It was professional. Fast or Slow had beaten him twice. And there were some questions asked as whether this was a new legitimate challenger to him at Cheltenham. But look, he beat him fair and square. It was a really solid performance. And I know Chris touched on the Mullins factor there, and you mentioned some of the star horses. I mean, the overriding feeling I had from the weekend was, it's some achievement to not only have these horses, but to have them all firing and in form. And bar Gaelic Warrior, who was the only major disappointment from Mullins, and he still won the race anyway. All of star performance turned up and produced very, very good performances. They didn't just win, they produced very good performances. And you only need to remember a week ago to see John Bond not turn up and be beaten at a huge odds. So, for all that, I'm sure we'll come on to the fact that it was dominant, they all turned up and produced. I thought the one for me I took away from it was State Man. I thought just a really proper horse. And I think a lot of people will get behind Constitution Hill and just the excitement behind him, but I'm very much a fan of State Man. Just turns up, does his job time after time, and I think the overriding feeling after Sunday was, you know what, he possibly isn't as good as Constitution Hill, but you'd expect him to get closer in the Champion Hurdle this year. But yeah, an exceptional weekend, and to have all those horses firing. I mean, it's easy to say, oh well, they're all favourites. To get them all right, to all turn up, it's a hell of an achievement, to be fair.
Certainly is. But let's stick on State Man for a second there, because that was certainly one of the most eye-catching performances of the weekend. An 8th Grade 1, only Constitution Hill has stopped him in Grade 1s, and he looks the only horse who can stop Constitution Hill. Indeed, Ed Quigley on Twitter put out a tweet sort of suggesting that State Man might be the only horse that turns up against Constitution Hill at Cheltenham. There are very, very few probable runners in the Champion Hurdle betting. Do we give him a sniff, Chris?
I mean, yeah, look, I'll go straight in and say I think you have to give him a chance, just because he is clearly the second best. I mean, like, there's no doubt about it. Like, bar Lossiemouth, who probably won't run and seems impossible to run, he's clearly second best. And look, everyone will get behind Constitution Hill and say, he's a certainty, he's the next big thing. These horses don't fire, and it'd be no surprise if it's State Man, because he is just rock solid and consistent. He'd be an amazing horse to own. If I could own a horse, it'd be a horse like State Man.
Or Constitution Hill. I mean, that's the
Constitution Hill, either, yeah.
The problem for me is that they've taken each other on, and we know what happened, and I can't quite see a reason why it's going to be different. We don't think that State Man ran below his form that day, or certainly not significantly below. So it comes down to well-being. If they both turn up in their optimum conditions for the Champion Hurdle, I feel that there's only going to be one outcome. But you do always, with jump racing, you've always got that sort of wild card factor. Stuff can happen. Horses can, lose their attention going to a hurdle. They can spook at something. And of course, there's always the ill health thing. But I think Constitution Hill is one of those rock solid favourites where, barring some sort of stepping on a stone at the wrong moment, I certainly, as a punter, wouldn't be looking to oppose him. I don't see any vulnerability there.
And Bill, possibly we should be coming to you for your stock market tips instead of your Cheltenham Festival tips. What do you reckon?
Oh, well, you're right. It's my attention has sort of been focused away from the track since I've taken over this job. But I can't see Constitution Hill getting beat, which is no great insight. But as Chris says, things can go wrong. Horses can see shadows and take off a stride early. You never know.
Well, indeed. Let's turn then to the 8-ton elephant in the room, which is the topic of Willie Mullins' utter domination of the Dublin Racing Festival and his scarcely lesser dominance of jumps racing as a whole. Chris, your front runner email this morning tallied up the favourites for the Cheltenham Festival, and you excluded a few of the handicaps which had less mature markets. I think it was 23 you looked at in total, 23 races, 12 Willie Mullins favourites. Is that right?
That's right. And it's been that sort of proportion all the way through the season. I started looking at all these favourites back in November, and he's sort of consistently had slightly more than half of all the races that you're looking at. He's got the favourite, and that's only the sort of surface. There's great strength and depth. Some of those horses he has to choose a target. Ballyburn, for example, could go Supreme or Bearing Bingham. you would think that he'll go Bearing Biggin, because then Willie's got the horse who would be left as favourite for the Supreme and Mystic Power. And he's got Fact of File, who could go one of two ways as well. But you would think you go for the shorter race and leave Grange Clare West as the favourite for the Brown Advisory. So I mean, it's that astonishing strength and depth. His record at the Cheltenham Festival, I think, is 10 wins. That's the best he's done. But he's got such a strong hand this time. Realistically, I'm kind of getting to the stage where I expect him to beat that. Extraordinary as that may seem, 28 races and one person can win more than 10. When I started sort of loving the Cheltenham Festival, it was a really big deal if a trainer had more than one winner in that week. Obviously, fewer races in those days. I think it was 18. But with the sort of increase in the number of opportunities to win at the festival, has come a sort of much greater concentration of firepower in the best yards, and Willie has benefited in particular. I mean, you have to give him credit for that, because a lot of these horses he's sourced, some of them were available on the open market, and he and his talent spotting crew saw the potential and have brought these horses along. But it's extraordinary the depth that he's got. I mean, he lost Allaho, who won't be running in the Ryanair. For most stables at most stages in the history of jump racing, losing a horse like that in the middle of the season would be just a disaster. And that the kind of thing that sort of you might take away all your hopes of getting a big winner at the Spring Festival. But they just roll on, and they've got so many other top class horses to go there. They've got a horse like Gallic Warrior, realistically might not even go, because obviously it was a disappointing performance at the weekend, but we know he's got lots of talent. He's run well twice at the festival in the past, but they're in a position where they can say, well, maybe let's just save him for Fairyhouse and Punchestown. He's not ideally suited to Cheltenham, and therefore we won't go there. It's amazing for one stable to be in a position to make decisions like that.
And what do we think about the consequences of this? Because I'm always cautious about going too deep into this navel gazing to such a degree, because for most people the Cheltenham Festival is just the most fantastic week of sport of the year, and we really need to be careful that we don't sort of over analyze the incredible dominance of one individual. But clearly this is not good for the health of sport, and question mark for a betting product as well. Is this something which is going to have a detrimental impact on the appeal of Cheltenham to punters as well as people watching at home?
Well, I certainly think it makes it, and all of these races become less attractive just because they're dominated by one stable. Now that may be terribly unfair, because Willie runs his horses against each other, which most trainers don't like doing, and they're genuinely there to beat each other if they can. Hence, some of the results on Saturday were, it was a surprise which Mullins horse came out on top, and that was also a theme at the Dublin Racing Festival last year. But I think fundamentally, punters would rather all these horses were spread around different people. That just makes it more attractive when for sure that they're all out there to beat each other over the head if they can. And that's the sort of sport that you and I sort of grew up with, and it's a real adjustment to be thinking about, well, these horses are in the same yard, so do they know which one is better, or to what extent do they know? And, clearly that knowledge isn't perfect based on what happened on Saturday. They turn up and you find out at the races which is best. But I think it is off-putting, and eventually it takes a lot of colour out of the sport, because other training stables are, they're sort of starved of prize money, starved of opportunities. I think it's going to have a chilling effect on levels of competition in the sport. We'll see other businesses dropping away. That's my great concern, is that it's not just the way things are now, but it's going to become more and more like that in the future. And I'm afraid that makes it less exciting as a sport and as a betting opportunity. And I appreciate it's very difficult, very unattractive for the sports officials to start thinking about what they should be doing to step in and restore levels of competition to what they used to be. But I do think, I'm afraid, that's something that has to be done. That's a discussion that really ought to be going on right now.
Just on betting turnover there, one of my other takeaways from this weekend was the Dublin Racing Festival is a really interesting change to the picture of the Cheltenham Festival, because what I think Willie Mullins has been able to do this weekend is answer some of the questions that trainers traditionally may have wanted to have answered at the Cheltenham Festival beforehand, a month ahead. Now, I know that's the job of trials. The job of trials races is to decipher what's going to happen. But if you take, for example, the Dublin Chase, Dino Blue, Willie Mullins was saying after the race that this horse was working really, really well. And if El Fabiola wasn't going to turn up, this would be interesting, how close she could get to him. She ran really well and finished second and was beaten 8.5 lengths. So Willie Mullins after the race said, well, we'll go to the Mayor's Chase. So suddenly the picture of what he can do with his Cheltenham Festival horses becomes clearer because of the opportunities presented at Dublin Racing Festival. So from a betting turnover perspective, the sort of value of going, well, I think Willie Mullins has gone over a trip too short here with this novice, that's sort of known in advance. So from an impact of when people will look at it blankly and say, oh, there are X amount of odds-on favourites at the Cheltenham Festival. Well, it's because a horse like Ballyburn has been able to run at the Dublin Racing Festival, win really impressively, and suddenly you know a lot more about them. Is that good and bad? Well, on the one hand, we get to see these horses more, which is something we're always complaining about. But it does impact it. I mean, it's hard to criticise running horses, but this has got a huge knock-on effect to how the picture of the Cheltenham Festival looks.
Does this bring us back to the age-old point? There are simply too many opportunities for these top-class horses. And I'm not talking about the Dublin Racing Festival. I'm talking about the number of races at festivals like Cheltenham.
I mean, I basically think that is an issue, but tracing back the history of how these things have gone specifically at the festival, it seemed to me that the connection between an increasing number of odds-on shots at the festival was more with individual trainers starting to win many more races than they ever used to, rather than with the increase in the number of races. I mean, when the festival went from 3 days to 4, that was a big deal. But actually, it didn't seem that the favourites were getting any stronger, the winners were getting any more obvious in the years immediately after that happened. But it was more when we got to the years of trainers winning 5 or 6 or 7 individual races at a single festival. That concentration of talent, it seems to me, is what's led to the thinning out of competition and favourites becoming hotter than they ever used to be. I mean, the average number of odds-on favourites at a single festival used to be 0 or 1, and that was true for about 15 years through the sort of 90s. But these days, the average is 5 per year, and we're already up to 4 for this coming festival.
Let's move on to another aspect of the Dublin Racing Festival, which is its ever-growing popularity with racegoers, who certainly don't seem to be bothered that it's the Willie Mullins Racing Festival. 36,000 over 2 days, 1,500 up on the prior year, and by all accounts, a very significant British contingent among the racegoers. It's really been taken to heart by racegoers on both sides of the Irish Sea. Chris, you've written a lot in recent weeks, including a column last week, about the experience for racegoers and how it hasn't necessarily evolved a great deal over the years. And you're speaking specifically about those who are going primarily for the sport rather than for all the fantastic social elements that go around the biggest meetings. What do you think Leopardstown is getting right that potentially others are not?
I think that specific weekend, I mean, I should say I haven't been for a few years, but I think that concentration of top quality races, the impression that you're seeing the best horses in the whole sport, I mean, that's tremendously attractive. They've taken what were 2 or 3 different fixtures, I think, and amalgamated the best of them. So you don't just have the sort of the grade ones, which are going to lead to the Cheltenham Festival, but you've also got some really fantastically competitive handicaps. A very good friend of mine was who'd been going for the last 3 years, was in touch on the way home last night and saying, him and his mates had the best time ever. It was really good. Equally, I saw some tweets, where people were talking about the facility seemed to have come under a bit of strain with that number of people. I think Leopardstown hasn't always been used to having that kind of number of people present, having a really good time. I think it just works a bit like the Cheltenham Festival because the sport is so good. And you hope that's going to continue to be the case. You know, there were some problems, obviously. You had the 2-runner novice chase on Sunday. You know, we can't have that kind of thing happening too often. The Irish Gold Cup has sometimes suffered from small fields in the past. You know, they need to make sure that those races continue to be sort of well populated. But you know, it just looks like a really good time. The column I wrote last week was sort of more thinking about day-to-day racing. When you're not going to get the socials, you know, the B scenes and the day outers. If racecourses, you know, want to sort of keep their attendances up at those meetings and some of the sort of Saturdays, which are, you know, quality stuff, but again, aimed more at people who love the sport. In the depths of winter, you know, you're not going to get the people who love to turn out for Royal Ascot. It feels to me that they have to be making more of an effort to pitch themselves at people like me who love the sport, who want to go, you know, purely for the, you know, the action, the horses, the quality jockeys, you know, rather than worrying about the sort of food and drink offering, you know, or am I going in style, you know, am I in the lap of luxury? And you know, for all the developments that have been made in the show that Racecourses put on over the last few decades, I'm not sure how much of it has been aimed at people whose first interest is the sport itself.
And this isn't just the sort of midweek fare as well. I mean, it's been highlighted by both you and Lee Modderhead that some of the sort of you know, real highlights of the jump season have been hit by falling field attendances. The King George, perhaps the most publicised in recent months, which has experienced a very sharp fall, particularly since pre-COVID times. So, how do we think the sport can go about addressing this? James, I'll bring you in here. What can racing do to make fixtures like jumps racing, like midweek racing, stuff that is primarily there to appeal to the sport's core audience more attractive and draw people through the gate more often?
Well, I would say if racecourses genuinely want to do that, then they need to go out there and physically ask those racegoers. They need to go to them and say, what is it that we can provide better? Because that is the way to do it. We talk a lot about data-led approach, and I think if you look at businesses that are well run, that you'll get emails where they send you surveys, they send you things. The reason is they want to know how they can get your money, really. That's the truth of it. So that's what I would suggest they do. From my own perspective, and looking at Leopardstown, having gone racing to Punchestown last year and Galway the year before, what Ireland has, and I think what the appeal of the Dublin Racing Festival has, is value. And maybe that's not necessarily value compared to sporting events around the UK, but sporting events in this country, racing events, sorry, in this country. So things like the Cheltenham Festival, we've all talked about the £7.50 pint at Cheltenham. Punters feel they're just paying too much and they're just being ripped off, and it's such a bleak feeling where you're having to question. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people who live here in Cheltenham, where I am, and people who live outside of Cheltenham, where it's not just the racecourse, it's the accommodation, it's going out for a meal, it's everything like that. It costs so much money that people who love Cheltenham, they think about Cheltenham all year long. They watch a meeting like the Dublin Race Festival and it's all about Cheltenham. They're being tested because they're going, I don't really want to be ripped off this much. I've seen things on social media about people who are going to Spain to watch it because it's cheaper, and it's just extraordinary that the sport has allowed itself to really push people away. That's exactly what it's doing. But those midweek meetings, I cover a lot of them, and I think the key areas that I would say they need to be improved on is creation of something more than just a day at the races. I mean, those days are good, but just add something different, add a different element to it, add something that really draws you in, whether that be a price, whether that be there's a different type of, I don't know, food offering, or the main race of the day has a big jockey, and maybe there's something like a meet and greet or something like that. Just something that makes you stand out from just, here's a list of fixtures, which one do you want to come to? Because that just isn't quite selling. The leisure pound is under so much scrutiny, and the concept that racecourses can just open their doors, expect people to come in, it just doesn't quite work. And the final point I'll say about racecourses, I think this is a massive one, is that when you go to those meetings and it's quiet and there's not much of an atmosphere, for people who own racehorses, that must be really difficult, because you've invested so much money to have that moment of having a winner. And when there's 4 people around you in the parade ring, it must feel so flat. And I mean, if you're buying into a syndicate of this dream of a big winner, and it really underpins it. So I think there's a knock-on effect at every level.
I wonder if, the money that racecourses get for the, media rights from just the fact that these races are being screened in betting shops and online has to some extent, blunted their focus on making sure that people coming through the gates. I mean, there are some of these fixtures where it's always been a struggle to get a large attendance, and then when people get there, you have to have food outlets open and so on, which cost you a certain amount of money, and you won't necessarily make a huge profit on it if people unexpectedly don't turn up. So it nearly becomes like, for some of these low profile fixtures, that having a crowd is actually a problem. I really think in order to ensure the sport's future support and future relevance, we need to get back to thinking about, let's make sure people turn up, and when they turn up, let's make sure that they have a really good time, and that they enjoy the sport, that they're engaged in the sport, they learn about it, because following the storylines that the sport throws up is what's going to make sure that these people are bonded to racing in the future. I do worry about the flow of information. We still do things in a very traditional way. If you turn up at the races, you get if you're lucky, there might be a chat between a couple of people in the paddock about what might win, before the racing starts blaring out over the tannoy, and then you might get an interview with the winning trainer. I mean, great for them. Obviously, everyone deserves their moment in the sun, but all winning interviews do tend to sound a bit similar. And there's real interesting stuff happening in the racecourse that doesn't get picked up on, doesn't get related to the people who are there. The example I gave in the piece last week was, I was at Cheltenham and a horse in your snout leather snapped, and people watching it on TV at home are immediately made aware of that. But if you're at the races, you can be there the whole day and never find out about that until you get home. You shouldn't be sacrificing that kind of knowledge and awareness by turning up at the races. You shouldn't be fully aware that you're not up to speed in the same way that people watching ITV would be.
Thanks very much, guys. We're going to move on now to a story which we've covered extensively on the front page over the last couple of years, but that is moving towards a significant milestone, because on February 26th, MPs in Westminster will debate the subject of affordability checks, following a petition calling for the checks to be scrapped, which soared past 100,000 signatures in less than 4 weeks. Bill, you've been following this story very closely from its beginning, of course. As we approach this debate, what message is the sport seeking to communicate to MPs?
From the petition that sparked this debate, the message is very much that we don't want the affordability checks, as they're currently proposed by government, to come into force. That might be a stretch. You might be expecting the government to make a U-turn there that they might not be prepared to make, but it's putting pressure on ministers. And certainly putting pressure on ministers to make sure that the damage to the sport's finances, which its leadership estimate could happen up to £50 million a year, the pressure is on ministers to make sure that isn't the case. So we've sort of launched a campaign to make sure that MPs, especially those representing constituencies with racecourses and racing interests, attend this debate at the end of the month on February the 26th, and make sure that they put that view across to ministers, and make sure that it's on the record, and make sure that their response to that is on the record. I do think this debate is going to be putting pressure on ministers at the DCMS to get some measures in place to mitigate this impact. I don't think Stuart Andrew I think the pressure from the Gambling Act review has been weighing fairly heavily on Stuart Andrew, and I'm sure that this debate is something that he'd rather not be happening. And I wrote last week that I think racing will be expecting him to come up with some answers on various things when he stands up and responds to MPs at the end of the month.
Stuart Andrew being the gambling minister, of course.
Yes.
What do we anticipate could be the outcome of this debate? What do we expect it to have any meaningful impact on government policy? Do we expect the gambling minister to say something substantive at the end when he speaks in response to the points made by MPs?
I think he's going to have something to say. Quite what that will be, I'm not entirely sure at the moment. There's various issues sort of still outstanding that we'd all like to hear something about. Firstly, the Gambling Commission's consultation on affordability checks closed in October. We still haven't heard their response to that yet. Apart from that, we understand there's been sort of efforts put in place to try and put the checks that are already in place, that operators have already been doing, sort of in anticipation of the gambling review. We understand that they're basically ministers have told the gambling industry and the Gambling Commission to come up with a uniform system that would ameliorate to some extent the ad hoc nature of the checks that are already annoying punters so much. That isn't something that racing or punters would particularly be pleased about. They'll be pleased in terms of it'll be something more uniform and hopefully less ad hoc and less damaging to racing's finances. But it's far from perfect.
And what are you hearing around progress in these critical areas?
Well, from what I understand, progress has been pretty slow on all fronts. And we haven't heard anything yet. I imagine that Stuart Andrew, when he stands up, will want to have something concrete to say and to offer to racing. Another aspect is levy reform, which the government has wanted to has brought forward its review of the levy system because it believes that there will be an impact from affordability checks on racing's finances. I think it's underestimated the true impact. But again, that review of the levy was announced in April last year, and we still haven't seen anything concrete there. And again, from what I understand, the Minister Stuart Andrew has basically told bookmakers and racing to get on with it and try and sort out their own solution, but that's proving impossible at the moment. So progress on various things is slow. I imagine Stuart Andrew will want to have something concrete to say on February the 26th, which will show some progress in some areas. So you'd expect him to be starting to bang heads together in various places to get something, so he's not stood there on February the 26th with nothing to say.
And of course, the clock is ticking here because an election is due to take place this year. Could happen as early as May, although the general sense seems to be it will be in the towards the back end of the year rather than in the first half of the year. What impact does that election have, both in terms of it being a ticking clock on these changes coming through, but also in terms of focusing politicians' minds on their imminent trial by public?
Well, that's absolutely right. It's another complicating factor. The government said it wanted these the various measures from the gambling review in place by the summer. as you say, there has been talk about a May election, although the autumn is more likely. But various ministers and MPs will be. It might prove to be a distraction.
Can I just jump in and say, my impression from the Scarlet stuff I read online is that it's very much a distraction. Bill, I wonder if you see any justice in this. I hear chat that there's basically two kinds of Tory MPs at this time. There's those who are making plans to be doing something else after the election. And then there's those who are determined very much to still be involved in politics, but who don't want to be burdened with responsibility for any electoral defeat that might happen, conceivably, potentially. And therefore, if you're one of those people who needs something done, who needs decisions taken, actions taken in the next 6 months or so, then you're just out of luck. Is there any justice to that?
Very possibly. As far as the gambling review measures are concerned, obviously Labour is a very big lead in the polls, and you'd imagine when there is election that the likelihood is there will be a change of government in some shape or form. How high up gambling reform will be on a potential Labour government's sort of to-do list, I've got to say I would imagine it's fairly low down. I imagine it's fairly low down the Conservative government's list of priorities at the moment. So it's possible that the process that's already been started might well continue under a Labour government, but that's just sort of conjecture at the moment.
Can I mention that before I came on the show, one thing I did was I sent a sort of an email drafted apparently by the BHA to my local MP to say, please be aware of this debate about affordability checks coming up in 3 weeks' time. Please attend because it's so important to horse racing. We publicised it in an article by you, Bill, I think last week. If you go to racingdebate.eaction.org.uk/email, there's a draft of a letter that you can send to your MP to call their attention to this subject that's so important for horse racing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. You've stolen my role.
I'm sorry.
Host every week. No. Absolutely. No, we will put that link in the description for this video as well. It is incredibly important that those who follow racing, who bet, who care about the future of the sport, do contact their MP to communicate the strength of feeling and the potential consequences of the affordability checks being rolled out and being proposed for bettors. We're going to move on to our final story, which concerns the licensing committee, British Racing's licensing committee decision last week, in which they found trainer Milton Harris to be not a fit and proper person to hold a license. Harris was found to be in breach of several conditions, including that he was serving as a company director, he was trading in bloodstock, and that he had intimidated and bullied a fellow trainer. The licensing committee also had serious concerns around safeguarding at his yard. Harris said he was disappointed by the finding, and there remains a possibility he could appeal against it. However, James, I think it's fair to say that anyone reading through the coverage, or indeed the extremely lengthy report put out by the licensing committee, would have been shocked by some of the contents within it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hugely. It's a bit of a dark day. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's very true. Described as ungovernable, which is just such a. When you sit and think about that, it's really quite concerning. All sorts of incidents in that case, and rightly the BHA have made the decision they've had to make. It's worrying, another worrying example for the sport, because it was only a month on from the BHA having to apologise after its safeguarding reported 350 reported incidents in 5 years, more of which half were relating to sexual misconduct and bullying. And it's not the first trainer as well to be subject to an inquiry. Johnny Farrelly was permanently excluded from the sport in 2021. So obviously these things happen, and it's very worrying. But the fact that there are multiple sort of examples of really unpleasant behaviour by individuals is very worrying. And people in positions of power, these are people who are employers. They're employing younger staff a lot of the time, and it's very worrying. I mean, racing staff is such an area of worry within the sport. In the work in a training centre here, and it's such a big problem. And I think it's an evolving problem as well. And it's one that's going to become more obvious as 2024 goes on. And incidents like these breaks the trust down. For a lot of young stable staff, will go to work in a yard, which in Cheltenham, for example, Cheltenham training bases are outside the town centre. It's young people away from home for the first time in their life. It's difficult as a parent to send somebody off for a career like that, especially when you've got doubts when stories like these come out. So the industry is under pressure as the staffing goes, and it needs to be absolutely crystal clear to make sure that the behaviour of everybody involved in the sport is up to scratch in what 2024 should look like. Look, it was not a nice read what's came out this week, and it's important that when these incidents happen, for all this is one person and it's an isolated case, you have to use examples like these to learn how the sport can do better, because there's enough evidence around in the last 2 months or so, or even a bit longer, to suggest that there are problems within this sport that need to be tackled. And it's good to read the NAS, National Association of Stable Staff Chief Executive George McGrath talk about this week that the sport really needs to up its game, because this is a huge area of concern, and it's only going to exaggerate that problem on stable staff, which fundamentally is what the sport operates on.
And Bill, we were talking before the show about some of these steps that have been taken in football. And I think which really illustrate both that racing still probably has to go further to take the sort of steps that have been deployed in other sports, but also just how significantly expectations have changed in this area over the, even the last 10 years, really. The expectations around safeguarding, around the treatment of employees, particularly young employees, have just changed out of all recognition.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a bit of a cliche that racing is quite change resistant, but the example that we were talking about, I'm always going on about them. My football team, Leeds United, I've got a very good young player called Archie Gray, who's only 17, that's been a fixture in the first team for this season. He's only 17, and because he's only 17, he has to change separately to the rest of the team, and that won't change until he's 18. And the Leeds United went on a tour of Australia a couple of years ago when he was involved, and he was offered a chaperone. So football has, which these seems quite an extreme thing to do, but football has changed in the way it deals with safeguarding. I'm not sure that racing has, and given some of the examples we've heard recently, not only in the Milton Harvest case, but also from the announcement that the BHA made last year, it would seem that this is another area where racing really needs to break through that resistance to change. I mean, the champion apprentice Billy Loughnane, 17 years old. I honestly don't know whether he has to change separately to the rest of the jockeys. I imagine he doesn't, and I imagine if he had to, it would cause even more complications. But yeah, it's certainly an area where racing needs to act, and I do think it recognises that. I was at a conference a couple of years ago where Dr. Eleanor Bowden gave a presentation about the treatment of female staff, which was pretty hair-raising. Some of the language and some of the treatment that female stable staff and jockeys have undergone. So this is definitely an area where racing needs to change. I do think it's recognised that, but I think it needs to maybe speed up that process.
Thanks very much, Bill. And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen, because we have run out of time. But my thanks for your contributions. I'm going to leave you with our front page for the week, which can only be the Willie Mullins Racing Festival, an absolutely sensational and in some senses worrying level of dominance at one of the season's highlight fixtures. Many thanks to my panel, James Stevens, Chris Cook and Bill Barber, for joining me today. Thank you at home for tuning in as well. We'll be back next week, hopefully from the studio, with more debate on all the big stories in racing. So until then, thank you again.